Hey everyone, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a custom heart bokeh brush in Affinity Photo. This pixel brush can of course be used on photographs, but it's also great to create illustrations like this one to be used as backgrounds on greeting cards, journals, and more. Now I'm using version 2 of the Photo iPad app. However, as long as you know where the tools are located, you should be able to follow along on the desktop version. You can also use either the iPad or desktop version of Designer. Let's get started. I'm going to start out by creating a 3000 by 3000 pixel square canvas set to 300 dpi. This is a pixel brush, and we're going to start by creating our heart shape. So because it's a raster element, we want to make sure that the nozzle that we're creating can be safely used at larger sizes without pixelation should the need arise. So I'm going to click OK, and I do want to note that my screen is flipped for a left-handed person, so your tools might be opposite of mine. Let's start by creating our heart shape. We're going to be creating a new intensity brush via the Brush Studio, but we need a shape to load first. The easiest way to create this is using the built-in heart shape under the rectangle tool. So the first thing I want to do is set my color to black. You want to make sure that to create these brushes, your shape is black. I'll go to the rectangle tool and then tap again to pull down the flyout and choose heart. And I'll just drag out a heart shape. I don't want to go to the very edges because we're going to be adding a blur to this, and I don't want any of the blur to be cut off by the edge of the canvas. So I'm just going to make sure that my snapping is on and center this up. And I think that's a good size, but I want to go back to the shape tool, and I'm going to drag this little red dot down. I don't want it to be such a perfect heart, so I'm going to bring that to maybe right about there. Now remember, bokeh is a blur effect, so we don't want to keep our edges this perfect. When you're creating an intensity brush, there's no way of blurring the shape within the dialog where you create the brush, so we need to do that now with a Gaussian blur. With my layer selected, I'm going to tap on the FX Studio. I'll toggle on Gaussian blur here at the bottom and then tap to engage the contextual menu, and I can either drag on the canvas or I can go over here to the slider. I'm just going to set this to 30 pixels. When we create the final bokeh illustration together, we're going to be adding a bit of blur to each layer, so I don't want to go too far here. This is just a nice base to start with. Now I'm ready to export this, but before I do that, I want to turn off my background. I want to get rid of the default white background that Photo adds. So I'll go up to the Documents menu, go to Canvas, and choose Transparent Canvas. And then I'll go back to the Documents menu and choose Export. I want to make sure that I set this as a PNG. Always set the export format first and then change anything else below. And I'm just going to name this Heart Shape 4 and click OK. I don't need to start over in a new canvas to create my brush. I'm just going to turn this shape off, and I'll just bring the background back. I just find it a lot easier than working on a transparent canvas. All right, with all of that done, let's head to the Brush Studio and begin creating our brush. If you ever can't locate a tool or a studio, just tap and hold on the question mark at the bottom of the screen and these labels will pop up. So I'm going to open up my Brush Studio, and I already have a category here for my bokeh brushes. If you'd like to add one, just go to the burger menu at the top and choose Add Category. Name your category and save it, and you're all set. You don't have to set up new categories, but as you add your own custom brushes, it really is a great way to keep things organized, so I do recommend it. The first thing we need to do is create a new intensity brush and pull in our shape. So I'm going to go back up to my burger menu, choose New Intensity Brush, select that shape that I just saved, and it's automatically going to pull up this dialog box that's going to allow me to change my settings. So we're going to start on this first tab, which is the General Settings. These allow us to set the defaults for the shape, which is known as the nozzle. That's going to be Photo's starting point as it's repeated across the canvas while the brush is being used. We're going to focus mainly at the top of the dialog box, starting with the brush name. Now I'm going to keep mine as Heart Shape 4, but you can change yours to whatever you'd like. Jumping to size, I'm going to set mine to 350. I can override this with the contextual menu as I'm using the brush, but this is a good default start. Now hardness sets the overall softness of the shape, but remember I mentioned that with an intensity brush, it doesn't make any difference if you change it here. So we've already added our blur. I'm going to leave this as is and jump right to flow. Flow controls the speed of the buildup of the brush as you move it around the canvas and the heart shapes overlap one another. I'm going to set mine to 60%. Let's move to accumulation. You can think of this in terms of opacity or the visibility of the brush nozzle. We're going to set a default opacity and then use dynamics in the next tab to vary that higher or lower than the default. Now, because this is a bokeh brush, it's blurred light, I don't want 100% opaque shapes, but rather soft spots of light that we can see through. So I'm going to set the default to, I think, 40% in this case. I can always change it if I want to, and then we're going to vary that with dynamics. And then finally, spacing sets the distance between each nozzle. So in this case, each heart shape as it's placed on the canvas. The lower the spacing, the closer the nozzle will be. So a very low setting is going to create something that looks like a solid line, and a higher setting creates more of a spatter or a spray. I don't really want any overlap in this case with these hearts, so I'm going to bring spacing all the way up to 200, which is the highest setting, and I'm going to vary that with the scatter settings in the dynamics. Before we move over to dynamics, let's talk about rotation really quickly. If we were creating this bokeh in camera, we would take an opaque card, cut out a heart shape, and place it over the lens. The only rotation of the shape would come from the cutout placed on the lens itself. So in other words, if the heart shape in the cutout is tilted slightly, then all of the resulting heart bokeh would be tilted as well. But they'd all be tilted in the same direction, even if slightly tilted. If you want to change the rotation of your heart shape a bit, in other words, you don't want it straight up and down, you can change it here, and that's going to change it for all of the heart shapes laid on the canvas. There is a rotation setting in the dynamics that varies that on the next tab, but we don't really want to touch that because it's going to change the rotation to something different each time it lays the shape down. And that's not how it would work if this were being done in camera. So if you want it to look like real bokeh, you want to make sure that all of your shapes run in the same rotation. I'm going to leave mine set to 0, but go ahead and set yours to whatever you'd like. Dynamics or jitter settings tell Designer how much you want to vary the default that you just set in the general settings. There are a number of settings here, but we're only going to focus on about 5 of them. The first thing I want to note is that you can change the controller for the variation to something like pressure, random, velocity. This is useful if you don't have a pressure sensitive stylus like an Apple Pencil or a Wacom pen if you're on a desktop, because you can still create variations simply by setting these controls to something like random or velocity. For my brush, I'm going to keep all of mine random because I like how the brush lays the bokeh in place, varying as it goes. There's no overthinking on my part. I'm also not going to touch the ramp settings on the spline graphs for this tutorial, but you can play around with different variations to see how they impact your brush. Let's start with size. I actually do not want to vary the size of my brush nozzle because if I'm trying to mimic real heart bokeh, it wouldn't be accurate. Remember, to create heart bokeh in camera, you place an opaque card with the shape cut out over your lens and then photograph your light source. Because the size of that shape doesn't change, all of the heart shapes in a real heart bokeh image would be the same size. So I'm going to keep this set to 0. We're going to skip over hardness because we've already created the softness in our shape and we don't want to vary that. So I'll skip right over to flow. I'm going to change this to random and I'll set my jitter to 100%. For accumulation, I want a nice variety of opacities across my canvas from very faint to more opaque. So again, I'm going to change this to random and I'll set this to about 80%. I can always change these if I find that they don't look just right. Again, we're not going to touch rotation and we're not going to touch shape because those wouldn't change if we were actually doing this in camera. So I want to leave those alone. I'm also not going to change hue, saturation, or luminosity. If I want to change the light values or the colors, I prefer to use blend modes and various colors for my brushes when I actually create the final image. I don't want to do that here. It doesn't give me the result that I want. So I'm going to skip right to scatter X and Y. Scatter varies the position of the nozzle on either the horizontal axis, which is scatter X, or the vertical axis, which is scatter Y. I want to change the controller on both to random, and I'm going to set the scatter X to 250 and Y to 150. I can always change this if I want. And that's all I'm going to change. I'm not adding any texture to the brush itself, so I'm just going to click Save, and I'm all set to use my brush. I want to test my new brush, so I've added a dark gray rectangle to the background. I want to grab the brush, and I'll just use this light color and start dragging around the canvas. Now it's automatically adding a pixel layer for me because I have my assistant turned on. If you don't, you can just add a pixel layer by hitting the plus sign and pixel layer. So I want to take a look at how this is overlapping one another, if I need to change anything. I also want to see how it looks when I change the blend mode to something like screen and add another layer. And again, how they're overlapping one another. This just lets me know if I need to change any of my settings. I like how this looks right here where it's overlapping the two. And I think this looks great. I'm going to leave my brush as is. But if I wanted to, I could just go back to the brush. If I needed to edit it, I'll just swipe right, hit edit. I can make any changes I need to either the general settings or the dynamics. I could even add texture if I want. Hit save and I'm all set. If you want to create a variation on your brush, you can swipe right, choose Save as New Brush. It's going to create a copy that you can rename, click OK, and then again swipe right to edit it, make your variations, and you're all set. I'm going to call this brush done. I like how this looks. I want to use it to create a layered heart bokeh image next. I've gone ahead and created a new canvas at 3000 pixels by 3000 pixels at 300 dpi, just in case I want to print this. The very first thing I want to do is pull in an image from the stock studio that I can turn into a gradient backdrop for my heart bokeh. You can either pull in one of your own images or, like me, pull something from the stock studio. The image itself doesn't really matter. It's about the colors in the images, because we're going to blur these all the way out to an abstract, so it gives us nice big blobs of colorful light for our background. I'm going to go to the stock studio and I'm going to key in Christmas lights. Not because these need to be Christmas lights, but because I know there's an image that I really like. So I'll hit search and I want to pull this one in. I'm just going to go ahead and use my move tool to place this where I want, size it the way that I want. So I like that right there. I'll move this over. I'm going to go to my layers, tap, and choose rasterize and trim. That's going to trim away everything outside of the canvas so I'm not adding weight to my overall image unnecessarily. So the next thing I want to do is create an abstract gradient out of this by adding a Gaussian blur from the FX Studio. This is going to mimic light in the background and give me, again, some really lovely blobs of color. So I'll go ahead and select the FX Studio. Once again, I'll toggle on the Gaussian blur, tap to get the contextual menu, and I'm going to drag this up pretty far. Something like that. Now you'll notice that the edges are pulling away. So what we need to do is go up to the top and tap on Preserve Alpha. That's going to fill in those spaces while still maintaining that blur. Now that the gradient's in place, I'm going to use my new brush to add multiple layers of bokeh with varying degrees of blur. This, along with setting the layers to the blend mode of either screen or lighten, is going to give me this beautiful layered effect, mimicking a bokeh photograph. I do want to note I've locked the background into place just so that I don't accidentally move it around. I want to go ahead and hit the plus sign and add a pixel layer. I'll grab my new brush and I want to sample a color from the image so that it doesn't look out of place. Go ahead and use my color picker here, and I think I'll pick this lighter color. Just tap to change it. Make sure the brush is selected and just start adding some shapes here. I don't want to overload with this because, again, we're going to be adding multiple layers. I can also tap instead of drag, and it's going to vary it as I tap. So this is a good start. What I want to do is this is going to be the furthest one from what would be the camera. So I want this to have the most blur. I'm going to go to my layer studio, and with it selected, go to the FX, tap to turn on Gaussian blur, and I'm going to set this to about 30. In fact, I think I might go a little higher than that, maybe go to 35. All right, so that's my first layer. That's going to be the bottommost layer. I want to go ahead and add another pixel layer. Again, grab my brush. I can use the same color or I can make it slightly lighter. It's all within the same family. And again, I'm just going to start adding some hearts. I'll just drag it around. And I want to overlap in some spots too. But again, I'm not overwhelming the image because we're adding multiple layers here. This time I want to change the blur of this to about 15. This is going to give the impression of depth because you have the furthest light source that's the most blurred. So it's as if you're shooting into lights. And I'm going to add one more. And this one's not going to be blurred as much. I'll grab the brush. Just add a few here and there. And maybe one right there. And this one, I'm just going to blur to about 3 pixels. All right, now one last thing I want to do is go ahead and I want to change the blend mode of these. So I want these to either be lighten or screen, depending on how it ends up looking. So let's go ahead and change this to screen. I like how these kind of overlay each other and give these little blobs of light. And that's coming from changing the blend mode. Now that all of those are in place, I want to add a few pops of color. So I'm going to go ahead and add another pixel layer, and I'm going to keep this in the back. I don't want these to be too obvious, but I just want them to be as if there's slight variations in the light that I'm photographing. So I'm going to go into my swatches and just choose maybe a nice red color. I'll go with this one. Make sure that my brush is selected, and I'm just going to tap here and there just to add a few. And I like to add some off canvas because really, if I were photographing this, some of this would get cropped out. It kind of lends to the realism. That didn't quite land on the canvas at all. All right, so this one, I want to change the blend mode. Let's see what lighten looks like. Be screen, we'll go with lighten. And I want to change the blur to something like 25 or 30. I don't want these to be in the foreground. I want them to be in the background. These are just supposed to be some nice little pops of color. And I'll add one more pixel layer. And this time I'm going to choose maybe a teal color of some sort. Maybe this lighter one. All right, just tapping some out here. And I'll bring this down. I think I'll bring this below the red. I'm going to change this to lighten. And again, I want to blur this out, I think to something like 30. And that just adds some nice little pops of color. If you're actually photographing bokeh, a lot of times you're going to catch other colors other than what's in the lights. And I just think this looks fun. So one final thing I want to do, and this is totally optional, is just to add some texture to this. If you followed my tutorials or my classes, you know I love texture. So I'm going to go ahead and add some here. I'm going to use a metal texture from the Stock Studio. And I like this one in particular. Again, this is completely optional, but I like some of the effects that you can get from it. I don't want anything too distracting, so I don't want like these spots here. I'm just going to bring this down to about here. And again, I want to rasterize and trim this. And I'm just going to play around with the blend mode and see what I like. So something like color burn can kind of be fun. It gives you this nice dark and the hearts show up, but I'm going to make this a little bit more subtle by bringing this to soft light and then just dragging this down. This is just kind of giving it that vintage camera feel. You could also add a noise layer if you want. I just tend to like adding texture instead. And that's it. Your heart-shaped bokeh brush is done and ready to be used. And we've already used it to create a fun layered bokeh image that can be used as a background for a greeting card, notebook, or much more. If there's a particular brush you'd like to learn how to create, let me know in the comments below. And if you have any questions or suggestions for another tutorial you'd like to see here on my channel, let me know that as well. If you like my teaching style, consider checking out my full-length classes either on Skillshare or my own learning site, The Creator Collage. I've linked to both below. I have lots more Affinity tutorials coming to my channel, but in the meantime, you might want to check out one of these two next. Thanks for watching.